The final sound she would ever hear from that world was the precise, mechanical click of a deadbolt sliding into its steel housing, a sound as clean and unforgiving as a line drawn in the sand. That single, metallic report was the period at the end of the long, gray sentence of her institutional childhood, a punctuation mark that severed her from the only life she had ever known and cast her out into the vast, indifferent grammar of the world. Elara stood on the cracked concrete steps, the worn fabric of her thin coat a pathetic defense against the autumn wind that tasted of diesel fumes and distant rain, and felt the immense weight of the silence that followed. For 18 years, her existence had been governed by the ringing of bells, the scrape of chairs on linoleum, and the echoing murmur of 100 other unwanted children. Now, the world was a vacuum, and she was a solitary particle suspended within it, defined only by the space she occupied and the sudden, terrifying absence of walls. The state had fulfilled its obligation. She was an adult, a finished product of its loveless assembly line, and the door was now closed not just to her past, but to any notion of retreat or return. She was utterly, terrifyingly, and finally alone. The severance was formalized in a manila envelope, thrust into her hand by a weary administrator whose face she could no longer recall. Inside, the entirety of her worldly inheritance was laid bare, a triptych of institutional pity and bureaucratic absurdity. First, a stack of bills, counted and recounted until the sum was burned into her memory. $112, a figure so specific and so meager it felt more like an insult than a support. Second, a deed, its paper brittle and yellowed with age, the ink faded into a ghostly script that bequeathed to her a property listed only as Alastair's Folly, located in a place called the Greylock Peaks, a name that sounded like a cough. The administrator had smirked when he mentioned it, a final, parting jest about some forgotten, mad ancestor and his worthless patch of rock. The third item was the most tangible and the most mysterious, a single, heavy key of rusted iron, its design ornate and archaic, its weight in her palm feeling less like a tool to open a lock and more like an anchor meant to drag her down. This was the sum total of her connection to a lineage she had never known, the punchline to a joke told by a dead man. $112, a cursed deed, and a key to nothing. It was the starter kit for a life she had no idea how to begin. The journey north was a descent into a colder, harder world, a methodical stripping away of color and comfort. It began on a bus that sighed and groaned its way out of the city's grimy orbit, its windows streaked with a film of dirt that blurred the landscape into a watercolor of muted greens and browns. With every mile, the gentle hills flattened into stark plains, and then slowly began to bunch and rise again into jagged, stony knuckles of earth. She transferred to a second, smaller bus in a town that seemed to be made entirely of damp concrete and suspicion, its passengers fewer and quieter, their faces etched with the harsh lines of a life spent wrestling with an unforgiving land. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying a bite that promised a winter of profound and brutal severity. The final leg of the journey was not a journey at all, but a pilgrimage on foot. The bus deposited her at a crossroads marked by a leaning signpost, and from there, a narrow track snaked up into the mountains, a scar of gravel and mud winding through skeletal forests of birch and pine. For hours, she walked, the iron key a cold weight in her pocket, the wind a constant, keening companion that clawed at her coat and whispered of isolation in a language older than words. The world she had known, with its bells and its walls, had vanished completely, replaced by an endless, vertical expanse of rock, sky, and a silence so deep it felt like a pressure against her eardrums. When she finally saw it, cresting a ridge that left her breathless from the climb, the reality of Alastair's Folly was a blow more visceral than any physical strike. The word ruin was too generous, for a ruin implies a former grandeur, a history worth remembering. This was simply a skeleton, a collection of failures picked clean by the wind and time. What had once been a small cabin was now a jagged wound in the landscape. 3 walls of stacked stone, slumped and leaning, fought a losing battle against gravity, their mortar long since crumbled to dust. The roof was a ghost, a memory suggested only by a few splintered timbers lying in a heap on the dirt floor, half buried in a slurry of mud and rotted leaves. The only feature that retained any semblance of its original form was the chimney, a tall, defiant pillar of black stone that listed to one side like a drunken headstone, its hearth a gaping mouth filled with debris. Adjacent to the collapsed structure, a dark opening in the mountainside, boarded over with weathered planks, suggested the entrance to a mine, another monument to some forgotten effort. The wind, here at the top of the world, was not merely a current of air but a living entity, a predator that howled and shrieked around the broken stones, its invisible claws tearing at the very fabric of the silence, promising to scour away anything that dared to stand against it. This was not a shelter. It was a grave waiting to be filled. For 3 days, despair was her only companion, a cold, heavy blanket that smothered all thought of action. She found the most sheltered corner of the ruin, a nook where two of the broken walls met, and huddled there, drawing her knees to her chest as if to make herself too small for the vast emptiness to notice. The first night, she managed to build a fire, a pathetic, sputtering thing made from damp twigs and the driest splinters of the fallen roof beams. It produced more smoke than heat, a plume of gray that the wind immediately seized and ripped to shreds, and it offered no comfort, serving only to illuminate the stark misery of her surroundings. Her meager supply of food, a loaf of bread and a wedge of hard cheese, dwindled with each reluctant bite. The water from a nearby stream was so cold it made her teeth ache. Time lost its meaning, measured not in hours but in the slow, agonizing crawl of the sun across the gray sky and the deepening chill that sank into her bones when it disappeared. The thought of surrender became a seductive whisper in the wind. It would be so easy to simply lie down, to close her eyes and let the cold do its work. It would be a quiet end, a final capitulation to a world that had made it clear from the moment of her birth that she was not wanted. The paralysis was profound, a physical weight that pinned her to the damp earth, and she did nothing but watch the clouds scud across the sky, waiting for an end she felt she had no power to resist. The turning point did not arrive with a crash of thunder or a blinding epiphany, but with the quiet, stubborn insistence of a single, tiny wildflower. On the morning of the 4th day, as she stared with numb eyes at the gray rocks that formed her pathetic shelter, she noticed it, a fragile stalk of purple heather, no thicker than a thread, that had forced its way through a crack in a granite boulder. It was bent almost double by the relentless wind, its tiny bell-shaped flowers trembling, yet it held on. It did not bow. It did not break. It simply endured, its vibrant splash of color a defiant gesture against the overwhelming monochrome of the mountain. She watched it for a long time, this insignificant speck of life, and felt something stir within the frozen sea of her despair. It was not hope, not yet. It was something hotter, cleaner. It was a clarifying rage, a sudden, incandescent fury at the administrator's smirk, at the condescending pity, at the closed door, at the wind that sought to scour her from this rock, and at her own willingness to be scoured. The world had judged her, weighed her, and found her wanting, leaving her to die in a pile of forgotten stones. The heather trembled in the wind, but it lived. And in that moment, a new and terrible resolve solidified within her. She would not be the punchline. She would not be a ghost. She would fight. The first act of her new life was one of pure, mindless, physical exertion. She rose from her huddle, her muscles stiff and screaming in protest, and began to clear the debris from the floor of the ruin. There was no plan, no grand design. There was only the raw, immediate need to impose a small measure of order upon the chaos that surrounded her, to answer the formless violence of the wind with the focused intention of her own hands. She heaved aside the splintered, rotted timbers, their surfaces slimy with decay. She clawed at the deep mulch of leaves and mud, scraping it away with a flat piece of stone until she reached the hard-packed earth beneath. Her hands, soft and unused to labor, were quickly raw, then blistered, then bleeding. The muscles in her back and shoulders burned with a clean, sharp fire that was a welcome antidote to the dull, internal ache of hopelessness. Each stone she lifted and tossed onto a growing pile outside the walls was a repudiation of her despair. Each armful of debris she cleared was an argument against surrender. The physical pain was grounding, real, a testament to the fact that she was still alive, still capable of action. She worked until the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, until her body trembled with exhaustion. And when she finally collapsed, it was not in surrender, but in the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had earned their rest. The discovery came on the second day of her labor, a reward for her defiance. As she was clearing the deepest pile of rubble near the base of the great stone chimney, her makeshift shovel, a long, flat shard of slate, struck something that was not earth or stone. It made a dull, metallic thud, a sound alien to this world of rock and wood. Curiosity, an emotion she had thought long dead, flickered to life. She dropped the slate and dug with her bare, raw hands, pulling away the dirt and rocks with a frantic energy. Slowly, a dark, rectangular shape emerged from the ground. It was a heavy chest, forged from iron and bound with thick straps of the same metal, its surface pitted and scaled with a deep, ancient rust. A large, ornate lock, sealed by time and corrosion, sat on its face. For a moment, she simply stared at it, this impossible object unearthed from the grave of her inheritance. Then, with a jolt of recognition that shot through her like lightning, she remembered the key. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers clumsy with cold and anticipation, and pulled out the heavy piece of iron. It felt different now, no longer an anchor but a promise. With trembling hands, she brushed the dirt from the keyhole and slid the key into the lock. It resisted, grating with the protest of long-disused metal, but with a final, determined push, it seated itself. She turned it, putting the whole weight of her arm and shoulder into the effort. There was a loud, groaning crack, the sound of rust and time giving way, and the lock sprang open. She lifted the heavy lid, her heart pounding against her ribs, and a scent rose from within the chest, the dry, clean smell of old paper, leather, and forgotten knowledge. The contents were packed with meticulous care, preserved from the damp by a lining of oilcloth. On top lay a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a single, stylized initial, an A. Beneath it, nestled in a bed of dried herbs, were several rolled-up schematics, tied with twine and drawn on heavy vellum with the precise, elegant hand of a master draftsman. She opened the journal, her fingers tracing the faded, looping script. It was the chronicle of her great-grandfather, Alastair, the man dismissed by the world as a madman. But these were not the ramblings of a lunatic. They were the meticulous notes of a brilliant, visionary scientist, an engineer decades, perhaps centuries, ahead of his time. He wrote of thermodynamics, of thermal mass, of geothermal gradients, of working with the mountain, not against it. The schematics were the visual representation of his theories, a blueprint for a revolutionary survival system he had named the Ethelberg system. It was a design of breathtaking elegance and simplicity, centered on two core principles. The first was a high-mass masonry stove, a cachalophin, built into the central chimney, designed not to burn constantly, but to be fired intensely for a short period, storing the immense heat in its dense ceramic and stone mass, and then radiating it gently and consistently for days. The second, more radical component, utilized the abandoned mine shaft. It was a passive geothermal heat exchange system, a series of pipes that would draw the cold air from the surface, pull it deep into the earth where the temperature remained a constant, stable coolness above freezing, and then vent the pre-warmed air back into the living space, creating a constant, gentle circulation that prevented the deep, killing chill of the mountain winter from ever taking hold. It was a system that did not fight the cold with brute force and endless fuel, but instead harnessed the mountain's own deep, abiding warmth. It was genius. In the span of a single afternoon, sitting on the cold ground with her ancestors' legacy spread before her, Elara's world was remade. The ruin was no longer a symbol of failure, but a foundation of possibility. The listing chimney was not a headstone, but the heart of a future hearth. The boarded-up mine was not a scar, but a lung, waiting to breathe life and warmth into a new home. The plan that formed in her mind was audacious, a complete departure from any conventional notion of rebuilding. She would not reconstruct the flimsy wooden cabin that had failed. She would follow Alastair's designs to the letter. She would build his fortress of warmth, a semi-subterranean structure integrated directly into the stone of the mountain, using the fallen walls as her primary material. Her shelter would not be a box placed upon the land, but a dwelling that grew from it, an extension of the mountain itself. The work would be immense, a task that seemed impossible for a single pair of hands. But looking at the elegant lines of the schematics, feeling the weight of the journal in her lap, she was filled not with doubt, but with a profound and unshakable sense of purpose. Alistair had left her more than a pile of rocks. He had left her a blueprint for survival, a testament of quiet, patient wisdom. Her inheritance was not a folly. It was a promise. The journey back down the mountain track was a different ordeal entirely. The first time she had been a ghost, hollowed out by despair and invisible to the world. Now, she was a creature of fierce, focused intent, and her appearance reflected the grueling labor of the past weeks. She was gaunt, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with sweat, her clothes torn and stained. Her hands were a map of her work, calloused and crisscrossed with healing cuts. As she walked the single dusty street of the town, which was little more than a collection of gray buildings huddled against the wind, she drew stares. The townspeople, wrapped in their thick wool coats, looked at her as if she were an apparition, a wild thing that had wandered down from the cursed peaks. They saw the dirt and the feral intensity in her eyes, and they whispered and turned away. She paid them no mind. Their world of quiet judgment and conventional wisdom was no longer hers. She had a purpose that burned too brightly to be extinguished by the curious glances of strangers. She was on a mission, armed with a list transcribed carefully from Alistair's journal and the last of her $112. She found the town's only general store, a cavernous building that smelled of sawdust, oiled leather, and coffee. Behind the counter stood a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire space. He was large, with a florid face and a booming voice, and he introduced himself as Marcus Thorne, the proprietor of the store, and, he made sure to add, the chairman of the town council. He looked her up and down with an expression of open, condescending amusement. When she handed him her list, he let out a short, barking laugh. Fire bricks, refractory mortar, a specific type of grogged clay, several lengths of 8-inch flue pipe, and a coil of copper tubing. What in God's name is a slip of a girl like you building up on that cursed mountain? He boomed, holding the list as if it were a dead rat. She simply met his gaze, her silence a stark contrast to his bluster, and stated that she was rebuilding. He laughed again, a sound that grated on her nerves. Rebuilding Alistair's folly? Child, that place is a death trap. Your great-grandfather was a crackpot who poured all his money into that hole in the ground and froze to death for his trouble. He leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that carried through the entire store. You need lumber, insulation, a good cast-iron stove. Not this alchemical nonsense. You'll be dead before the first snow. Mark my words. His words were a public performance, meant to humiliate her and reinforce his own status as the voice of reason and authority. But for Elara, they were like stones striking steel, creating not a dent, but a shower of sparks that hardened her resolve into something unbreakable. The total, when Thorne had finished ringing up the supplies she insisted on purchasing, came to $184. $72 more than she possessed. A triumphant, I told you so smirk spread across Thorne's face as he announced the sum. Elara felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. It was here, at this final hurdle, that her plan would die. As she stood in defeated silence, a second man emerged from the back of the store. He was older, wiry and bent, with a face like a weathered piece of driftwood and eyes that seemed to have seen 1,000 winters. He had been quietly stocking shelves, observing the entire exchange. This was Silas, the store's clerk. He shuffled over to the counter, looked at the total, then at Elara's face, and then at Thorne. The boy has grit. Thorne, he rasped, his voice dry as autumn leaves. More than you. He turned his gaze back to Elara. It's a fool's gamble, what you're doing. Everyone who's tried to make a go of it on that peak has failed. But his eyes, though skeptical, held a glimmer of something else, something that looked almost like respect. He saw not the dirt or the wildness, but the unyielding determination forged in her weeks of solitary labor. Silas sighed, a long, weary sound. I'll cover the difference. Call it a wager. A wager on stubbornness. Thorn began to protest, but Silas shot him a look that silenced him instantly. It was not an act of charity, and Elara knew it. It was a challenge, a grudging acknowledgement from one survivor to another. It was the first time since the closing of the institution's door that someone had looked at her and seen not a victim, but a fighter. The weight of that validation was more precious than any amount of money. The news of the coming storm fell upon the town not like snow, but like a judgment. It came over the crackling radio waves, spoken by a meteorologist whose calm, professional tone could not mask the apocalyptic nature of his forecast. It was not just a blizzard. It was a phenomenon, a once-in-a-century convergence of polar air and atmospheric pressure that the old-timers were already calling the Wolf Winter. A week of unprecedented cold and snowfall was predicted, a storm that would test the very limits of survival in the Greylock Peaks. The town, under the loud and confident direction of Marcus Thorn, erupted into a frenzy of preparation. His philosophy was one of brute force, a direct assault on the coming cold. His voice echoed in the town square, directing men to stockpile mountains of firewood, creating vast, teetering ziggurats of split logs beside every home. He organized convoys to the nearest city to buy up every available drum of propane and heating oil. The prevailing wisdom was simple. To survive the cold, one must burn something, and to survive an unprecedented cold, one must burn an unprecedented amount. The air filled with the constant roar of chainsaws and the rumble of trucks, a noisy, frantic war being waged against a silent, approaching enemy. Thorn was in his element, a general marshaling his troops, his arrogance swelling with every cord of wood stacked and every tank filled. While the town scrambled in a panic of noisy preparation, Elara's work on the mountain was a study in quiet, methodical purpose. Her preparations were the antithesis of the town's. Guided by Alistair's journal, she labored not to accumulate fuel, but to perfect her vessel. She rebuilt the collapsed stone walls, thicker and lower than before, packing the gaps with the grog clay and insulating moss. She constructed the cachalophin at the core of the structure, a complex maze of flues and chambers built from the fire bricks and refractory mortar, a massive, solid heart of ceramic and stone. She laid the pipes for the geothermal exchange, running them from a vent near the floor, down through the darkness of the old mine shaft, and back up to an intake high on the wall. Her woodpile, when she was finished, was shockingly small, barely a tenth of what the smallest home in the town below had amassed. It was a source of great amusement for the hunters who passed her property, shaking their heads at the foolish girl and her pathetic little stack of kindling. On the final day, as the sky turned a leaden gray and the wind fell into an ominous, expectant silence, she performed the last ritual described in the journal. She built a single, intensely hot fire in the stove's firebox, using the driest, most resinous pine. For 6 hours, she fed the fire, turning the interior of the stove into a miniature sun, until the outer stones were almost too hot to touch. She was not just warming her home, she was charging it, pouring thermal energy into the tons of stone and ceramic mass at its core. Then, as the first, tiny, hard pellets of snow began to fall, she sealed the firebox, closed the main flue, and opened the vents for the geothermal system. Her work was done. All that was left was to wait. The Wolf Winter descended with a fury that exceeded even the direst predictions. The wind, which had been a constant companion, became a physical entity, a solid wall of motion and sound that screamed with the voice of a banshee. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring torrent of white that erased the world, burying roads, houses, and the very concept of a horizon. In the town below, the battle for survival began immediately, and it was a losing one. The great cast-iron stoves, the symbols of Thorn's brute force strategy, became insatiable monsters, devouring the massive wood piles at an alarming rate. Houses were filled with roaring fires that heated the air 3 feet around them, while leaving the corners of the room thick with frost. The sheer force of the wind drove the cold through every crack and crevice, a relentless, infiltrating army. Propane heaters sputtered and died as regulators froze. Power lines, heavy with ice, snapped with a sound like rifle shots, plunging the town into a deeper darkness and a more profound cold. Fear became the new atmosphere, a palpable entity that was colder than the air itself. The mood shifted from frantic action to a desperate, huddled struggle, the residents burning through their fuel, their hope, and their warmth in a futile war against an enemy that could not be fought, only endured. Marcus Thorne's fortress of conventional wisdom was proving to be a house of cards. But miles above, nestled into the heart of the mountain, Elara's world was one of deep, profound, and absolute peace. The screaming of the wind was a distant, muted roar, the rage of a predator that could not find its prey. Inside the shelter, the silence was broken only by the gentle whisper of air circulating through the geothermal vents. There was no fire, no smoke, no roaring consumption of fuel. There was only warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a stove, but a gentle, pervasive radiance that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the walls and the floor. The thermal mass of the cachalophin, charged with the energy of that single fire, was now slowly, steadily releasing its heat, a silent, tireless guardian against the storm. She moved through her small space not in a frantic effort to stay warm, but in a state of calm security, her home an island of tranquil warmth in an ocean of lethal cold. She had everything she needed. She was safe. When the storm finally broke, after 7 days of unrelenting fury, it revealed a world transformed, a landscape of surreal and lethal beauty. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun shone on a world buried under a blanket of white so deep it had reshaped the very contours of the land. It was a pristine, silent, and utterly frozen tableau. Elara pushed open her heavy, insulated door, the wood scraping against the drift that had piled against it, and stepped out into the blinding light. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs, a physical substance that stung her skin. But from the shelter behind her, a gentle wave of warmth followed, a testament to the living heart of stone and earth she now called home. She was a solitary figure in a vast, white wilderness, but for the first time in her life, she felt not isolation, but a deep and abiding sense of belonging. Down in the valley, the town emerged from the storm not into beauty, but into devastation. Chimneys were dark, their fires long since extinguished. The great woodpiles were gone, consumed in the desperate, losing battle. Houses were iceboxes, their windows thick with interior frost, their inhabitants exhausted, frostbitten, and demoralized. The brute force approach had failed catastrophically, leaving them exposed and vulnerable in the brutal, post-storm deep freeze. It took another 2 days for a party from the town to make the trek up the mountain. It was a rescue mission born of grim obligation. Marcus Thorne led the way, his face a mask of grim certainty, eager to be proven right, to find the frozen body of the foolish girl who had ignored his wisdom. With him was Silas, his expression unreadable, his presence a fulfillment of the wager he had made weeks before. A few other townsmen followed, all of them expecting to participate in the grim task of recovering a corpse. As they trudged through the massive drifts on snowshoes, the ruin of Alistair's folly came into view, almost completely buried. It looked like a tomb. But then Silas, his old eyes sharper than the others, pointed. From the top of the listing stone chimney, a strange, faint heat haze shimmered in the frigid air. And on the low, snow-covered roof, directly above where the chimney stood, was a perfect circle of melted snow, revealing the dark stone beneath. It was an impossible sign of life. They reached the door, which was blocked by a formidable drift. With a shared, grim effort, they shoveled and pushed until it swung inward. As the door opened, they were met not by a wave of frigid, dead air, but by a solid, palpable wall of warmth, a gentle, fragrant heat that smelled of clean stone and dried herbs. They stood there, stunned into silence, blinking in the soft lantern light. And there was Elara, sitting at a small, sturdy table, a steaming mug of tea in her hands, and one of Alistair's books open before her. She was not just alive. She was comfortable, healthy, and thriving. The silence in the small shelter was thick with disbelief. Marcus Thorne stared, his mouth agape, his entire worldview crumbling in the face of this impossible reality. The cold that had nearly killed his town, the cold that he had fought with such loud, arrogant, and ultimately futile force, had been tamed here by a slip of a girl in a pile of rocks. How? The word was a choked whisper, a plea for an explanation that could salvage his shattered authority. Elara looked up from her book, her gaze calm and steady. She did not gloat. She did not preach. She simply answered with the quiet, profound truth she had learned from Alistair's journal. You try to make heat. I decided to store it. She explained the principle of thermal mass, of the stone heart that held the memory of a single fire for days. She described the geothermal loop, the way the mountain itself tempered the air, using the Earth's constant temperature as a shield against the sky's fury. It was a lesson in humility, in working with nature rather than declaring war upon it. For Thorn, each word was a nail in the coffin of his pride. The townsmen looked from the comfortable, thriving girl to their blustering, defeated leader. In that moment, his authority evaporated, replaced by a wave of public shame and ridicule. He had led them not to safety, but to the brink of disaster, while the person he had mocked most had achieved a level of security he could not even comprehend. He turned without another word and stumbled back out into the cold. Within a month, Marcus Thorne had sold his store and left the Greylock Peaks, a man disgraced by the quiet wisdom of an outcast. The story of the girl who had tamed the wolf winter spread through the valley like a slow-thawing river. Elara's status was transformed overnight. She was no longer the strange, feral creature from the mountain. She was a figure of awe and profound respect. The path to her door, once traversed only by a grim rescue party, became a route of pilgrimage. At first, they came one by one, then in small groups, led by Silas, who had become her staunchest advocate. They came not to gawk, but to learn. They saw the elegant simplicity of her home, felt the deep, abiding warmth, and they asked questions. Humbly, quietly, Elara began to teach. She brought out Alistair's journal and unrolled his schematics on her table, sharing the forgotten knowledge freely. She explained the principles of the Ethelberg system to carpenters, masons, and farmers, men and women who had spent their lives working with their hands and who understood the deep logic of her ancestors' designs. She was no longer an outcast. She had become the custodian of a new, yet ancient, wisdom, the keeper of a legacy that had the power to remake their world. Years passed, and the Greylock Peaks were transformed. The harsh lessons of the wolf winter had been learned, and under Elara's quiet guidance, the town rebuilt itself around the principles of resilience and harmony. The noisy, inefficient iron stoves were replaced by silent, massive masonry heaters that became the warm hearts of their homes. New houses were built lower to the ground, with thick stone walls and clever passive heating systems. The community learned to face the winter not with a frantic, brute force panic, but with the calm, methodical preparation that Elara had shown them. She, in turn, became a revered figure, a matriarch whose wisdom was sought on all matters, from building to planting. Her home on the mountain became a school, a library, a sanctuary of knowledge. She never sought power or authority. She simply shared what she had learned, and in doing so, became the unshakable foundation of her community. Her life was a quiet testament to a profound truth, that true strength is not found in the loud, arrogant assertion of dominance over nature, but in the quiet, patient, and humble understanding of its rhythms. The world had once discarded her, casting her out with nothing but a key and a curse, but she had found in that discarded inheritance a wisdom that had been forgotten, proving that the greatest value often lies hidden in the very places and people that society has deemed worthless.